following episode is part one of a two-part series we're doing with telescope maker Jerry Oltion. We had a great time chatting with Jerry, and so we're putting out two episodes. The Astronomer's Workbench with Jerry Oltion on episode 341 of the Actual Astronomy podcast. I'm Chris, and joining me is Shane. We are amateur astronomers who love looking up at the night sky, and this podcast is for everybody who likes going out under the stars. So, guys, what I'll do first is I'll just read a quick bio of Jerry, and then we will chat. Jerry Oltion has been a gardener, stonemason, carpenter, oiled field worker, forester, land surveyor, rock and roll DJ, printer, proofreader, editor, publisher, computer consultant, movie extra. I want to know more about that. Corporate secretary, magazine columnist, and garbage truck driver. Can't do anything with the garbage truck driver. And he also writes science fiction with 15 novels and over 150 stories published so far. He also writes a regular column for the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. And since we have many listeners who are science fiction fans, we hope you'll check him out, and his work's out on Amazon. Jerry became a regular columnist for Sky and Telescope magazine. He writes a column called The Astronomer's Workbench, featuring homemade astronomy equipment of all types, from simple accessories to complete telescopes. As a telescope maker, Jerry caught many readers' attention when he built the world's largest astroscan. Welcome to the show, Jerry. Great to have you on this evening.
Oh, thank you for having me. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, I hope you enjoy it. I think this is going to be a blast. You're sort of one of our special guests because we're doing this on a Thursday evening, and typically we don't record on Thursday evenings. But when you were recommended to us and passed along, we thought, oh, we have to get this in before we get into the summer hiatus. So thank you.
Well, you picked a good time because. This week I've actually got some time. I'm starting into a house painting project, and boy, I think the next 2 or 3 weeks are going to be very, very busy.
House painting. What are you doing when you're done your project?
Well, the thing is, I don't have any mirrors. I don't have any telescope projects going right now. So it's like, Kathy and I are like, well, maybe we should paint the house. So, keeps us busy, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Very good. Hey, before we get going, we should do a quick shout out to Mel Bartels for connecting us with you. And you actually bought Mel's Tridub. Do I have that right?
I did, yeah.
Can you tell us about that telescope and how it's worked out for you? Do you still own it? And yeah,
I do. I still own it. I still use it quite a lot. I think. Let's see. I bought it in 2010. What happened is we inherited a little bit of money. Not enough to buy a boat or a car, but it was just about enough to buy a big telescope. And I told Mel that I was looking for probably something in a 20-inch telescope range. And he said, well, why don't you buy my scope? And it never occurred to me that he would ever part with that, because he used to brag that up as probably one of the most perfect mirrors ever made. He worked on it and worked on it and worked on it until it was just stunningly perfect. And
wow.
Yeah, and then he offered to sell it to me. And I asked him, why in the world would you sell that scope? And he said, because I want to build a bigger one.
That's always the reason for selling. I want a bigger one.
That's right. He wanted to build a bigger one. And, so it was funny. We sat down and haggled over the price, and we achieved the sale price when we both were kind of wincing about equally. Mel was thinking, I'm basically selling you the mirror and giving you the telescope. And I'm thinking, no, I'm buying a pretty expensive mirror here. Zambudo wouldn't charge me this much for a mirror. But on the other hand, it's a fabulous telescope. And the neat thing about it is, at the time, I was driving a 2001 Volkswagen Beetle, and the telescope collapses down and fits in a VW Beetle. There's not very many. Yeah, not very many 20-inch telescopes will do that.
That's wild.
No, gee, that's incredible.
And the kicker is, man, I get that thing out in the field. I drive an hour or so out of town to get into some good dark sky, and I have probably the best 20-inch telescope ever. That mirror star tests perfectly.
Nice.
I've never been able to find any defect in it in a star test, and it shows me the crispest, best, wonderful images. The only thing it didn't. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say you're in Oregon as well, and so are you going out to do you go to the Oregon Star Party?
Oh yeah,
yeah. Okay.
Although I haven't been in recent years. Well, they haven't been holding it in recent years, but they're holding it again this year, and I do plan to go.
Excellent.
And I often take that scope. I've got other scopes that I also kind of like to show off. So some years I don't take that one. I take like my binocular scope or what have you. But I'll tell you what, every year when I do get up there with that 20-inch job, 2 a.m, there's still a line of people waiting to look through that scope.
I bet.
It's at least a regional legend, and I feel kind of weird having purchased a legend. But, I was in the right place at the right time and knew the right people, I guess. The only thing that scope did not do is it didn't track. Mel, he'd had that mirror at one time in a telescope that was computer controlled, but then he decided to go for portability, and so he built this TriDob, and so it didn't track. And I had gotten used to tracking telescopes, and so I kind of tried to figure out how could I make this thing track. And I came up with a new design for an equatorial platform that uses the ground ring of the telescope as the rigid part of the equatorial platform. And, very, very small little T-shaped platform underneath that holds the drive electronics and the rollers and stuff. And so it only added about 4 inches to the height of that telescope. And now I've got a 20-inch scope that tracks. So
wow.
Yeah, it's a dream scope, I got to tell you.
Yeah, that sounds incredible.
So I got to ask you about being a DJ. Tell us about being a radio DJ.
Well, that was a long time ago. That was back when Kathy and I lived in Cody, Wyoming.
Okay.
We moved there in 1980, 81, somewhere back in there. And Wyoming at the time didn't have any FM radio stations at all. And then they put one in Casper, which is like 200, 300 miles away. And then they put one in Cody. Some rich guy, he named it after himself. His name was Taggart, and so it was KTAG. Right. And I had, I'd been working and helping put Kathy through school. And then when she graduated as a medical technologist, she got a job in the Cody Hospital laboratory. So I didn't have to work. I started writing, but I started feeling guilty about not pulling in any cash. When you start as a writer, it takes several years to really build up any kind of reputation where you can actually sell anything.
Yeah.
So I was looking for work, and I was listening to this radio station, and I thought, the DJs aren't really very good. And my dad was a ham radio operator, so I was familiar with microphones and stuff, and I didn't clam up on the air. So I just drove down there one day and banged on the door, and they let me in. And the funny part is that as I was driving in, somebody nearly hit me in the parking lot. They were burning rubber on the way out and nearly crashed into me on the way out. And so I parked my car and went inside, and the receptionist asked, what they could do for me. And I said, well, I'm looking for a job as a DJ. And they just all cracked up. And I thought, well, what's so funny about me wanting a job? I know I'm funny looking, but it's radio. It doesn't matter. Right? So,
I have a face for radio too. That's why we do a podcast.
That's it. See, nobody knows what I look like yet. But they were laughing because the guy who nearly hit me in the parking lot had just been fired.
Oh,
he was the DJ that I thought wasn't very good. So they took me into the production studio and had me do like 5 minutes of just fake introducing songs and reading a news item or something, and hired me on the spot.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was so fun. I was doing like the 7 to midnight show, the late show. Yeah. Which worked out really well because my wife was working the evening shift at the lab, and cool. So we've been evening people ever since. We get up at 10 in the morning and go to bed at 2 in the morning.
And I got to ask, what movie were you an extra in?
Oh, what was that called? It was called The Four Diamonds, and
Okay.
it was filmed here in Eugene, Oregon. That's where I live. And Eugene is kind of a place where old hippies go to retire.
Yeah.
And so this movie was set in the early 70s. And so they filmed it in Eugene because they didn't have to get a lot of extras to wear tie-dye. It's like everybody, look at this. See, I'm wearing tie-dye right now. And, and I had a friend who was on the set. He was one of the, what do you call it? A grip. He's one of the guys that, gets the sets, gets the props and stuff. And he knew that they were doing a casting call for extras. And so he told me I should run down there and put my name in the hat. And he said, you already dress like a hippie, but put on your bell bottoms and your earth shoes too,
Yeah.
And so I did that. And it was so funny when the casting director looked at me. He just looked at me and kind of looked me up and down. And then he said, "You can't fool me. You wear that stuff all the time, don't you?" It's like, yeah, guilty. I grew up in Wyoming, and I was kind of a redneck out there. And when we moved to Eugene, I just totally moved to the left and embraced the tie-dye hippie culture.
That's great.
I always say that the 60s were like preempted for a football game back in Wyoming. So I didn't get much chance to live through the 60s, but I do it again out here. But I wasn't like a major player in the movie. What they wanted was my 69 Volkswagen Beetle.
Oh,
right. Actually, it's my wife's Beetle. She had that before she had me. There's a lot of scenes in there where there's cars going by, and that 69 Beetle is one of them. And so you don't see Kathy or me much, but you see our car.
and it's a purple Beetle, if I'm remembering correctly.
Kind of a bright blue. Yeah.
Bright blue. Okay.
Yeah. We're in the midst of restoring the interior this year. We've got the exterior pretty well churried out, and but the seat covers are terrible, and all the carpet's terrible. So we're redoing the interior now.
Nice.
It's funny, driving that thing around town, especially in a hippie town. Whenever I stop long enough to for somebody to run up and ask what year it is, and that everybody has a Volkswagen Beetle story, and everybody has to tell it to you. Because they haven't seen anybody else driving a Beetle for years. There's only about a dozen of them left in running order.
Yeah. All right. Maybe I'll sort of pass the reins over to Shane for a bit if you're up for kind of taking us on Jerry's astronomy journey a bit.
Yeah. So Jerry, how did you first get into astronomy? What was the first kind of interest there for you?
It came in two stages. When I was young, before my teenage years, I was probably 7 or 8 years old. My older brother got a 6-inch, it was a Criterion, I think it is, on one of those long F10 Criterions on the equatorial mount. He got one of those, and so I was able to look through that on occasion, and I learned my way around the sky a little bit. Then he went off to college, and I wasn't quite old enough to run the scope by myself. Then I went off to college, so I kind of got out of it. But as a science fiction writer, I was always still interested in astronomy and and astrophysics and cosmology and all of that. So let's see, it would have been the year of about 2003 after Kathy and I moved to Eugene. One Christmas, we were talking about what are we going to get each other for Christmas? And we couldn't think of anything. And we thought, well, why don't we just get a gift for the two of us? And we started kicking around ideas, and we came up with a telescope. And I thought, that could be kind of fun. So we bought this 8-inch, again, it was a Newtonian scope on a big old equatorial mount, a Conus. It was a knockoff of the Celestron C8. And it was a great introductory scope, but after we got used to it, we realized, the images weren't very good. It was kind of fuzzy, and turned out it was a really crappy telescope. But we didn't know. But we joined the astronomy club here in town, and we started learning the difference between a good telescope and a bad. And in a way, I'm kind of glad we got a lousy telescope to start with, because it taught us a lot more about optics. Trying to figure out what was wrong with it taught us a lot about optics, and parabolic mirrors versus spherical mirrors and stuff like that. So, I think I came out ahead for having a lousy telescope. And the interesting bit is the mail order place that sold it to me. I finally got the courage to call them up and ask if they would take it back. And the woman there just laughed and laughed and laughed. And she said, "You're the last one. I was wondering if you were going to call." And she said, "Everybody else we sold one of those telescopes to has returned it." So it was 6 for 6, she said, after I called.
Well, that's quite telling.
Yeah. And they replaced it with a Celestron version of the same scope. And I think I paid an extra $50 or so to help cover shipping or what have you. And that's a scope that we still use, but I've turned it into a Dobsonian. I just don't much care for equatorial mounts. So I've got it sitting at the edge of my garage where I can haul it out in the driveway in 2 minutes. I can be observing.
Yeah. That's great. Did you ever get into binoculars early on, or was it just kind of straight to the telescope and then, carried on with that path?
It was straight to the telescope. We have binoculars, but I don't honestly recall ever really pointing them up at the sky, other than maybe Jupiter. I remember from my early days, that we could see the moons of Jupiter. And so I would brace a pair of binoculars on the wall of the house or something and see if I could spot the moons. But that was probably the only thing I did with binoculars until several years after we got a telescope. I think it was a trip to Hawaii. We went to the island of Kauai, and we met up with some astronomy people there. And I wanted to have at least something of my own optics. And so we bought a pair of binoculars there on the island. And that was my first pair of astronomy binoculars. And they were just like 10 by 50s. But the Hawaiian people there, they showed us all sorts of cool stuff in the southern sky that we'd never seen before. So that was fun. Yeah, that was a kick.
Yeah, that's awesome. One thing we've kind of found out, Chris and I, doing the podcast and talking to a number of different guests, seems like almost everybody has like a telescope disaster story or sort of something bad that maybe happened while observing. And just curious if you have a telescope disaster story or something bad that's maybe happened to one of your telescopes, at some point.
Actually, I was thinking about that, and I want to tell two stories.
Okay.
First is I'll tell the story about one of the things that happened to one of my telescopes, and this is I built a travel scope that fits into a box that's only 6 inches high and 12 inches square, or 13, 12 and a half, something like that. Anyway, very small, like half a cubic foot, and it's a 10-inch or 9.5-inch travel scope. It's pretty good size optics. But you make some compromises on that, and one of them was that the balance point was not in the middle of the altitude bearings, and so I was using bungees to balance the scope. But what that really means is when the scope is tilted toward the horizon, it is nose heavy, even though the bungees are holding it from dropping down. The nose doesn't drop down. That doesn't mean that the center of gravity is over the center of the base. And I took let's see, I was trying to remember. I think I put an eyepiece in, and then I turned to look into my chart to find, where to look for this next object. And I heard a clunk behind me, and then there was a pause, and then there was this god-awful crash. And the last sound I heard of that crash was the rattly sound of a mirror hitting gravel.
No.
Oh yes. I could hear my mirror, and this is a mirror I made myself, right? And it was one of my best mirrors. I was really proud of that mirror.
Oh.
And I turned around and looked, and sure enough, the scope had nosed over and fallen off the altitude bearings and just kept nosing right on over, and it tipped upside down off the little table that it was on and crashed to the ground. And the impact busted the mirror clips, and so the mirror fell out and it landed face down on the gravel. And it was just heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm.
But I very carefully picked up the mirror and looked at it, and there was one tiny little scratch, like somebody had shot a grain of sand at it, right? That was the smallest. I mean, that was the biggest damage on it. Was this tiny little grain of sand scratch? And and I looked at the rest of the scope, and nothing really was broken. The mirror clips were broken, but everything was actually still functional. I was actually able to put it all back together and use it again that night. But I learned to put some stops on the altitude bearing, so if the scope noses over, it actually comes to a stop. And I also put a brake on it so that when I take an eyepiece out or put an eyepiece in, I can activate the brake and turn away in confidence. So yeah, that's probably the worst disaster. But honestly, nothing bad really happened. It was just one of those moments where your heart's in your chest,
Do that 100 times, and I'm pretty sure 99 of those times that mirror is in not very good shape.
Oh yeah. I was pretty sure it was going to be in pieces when I turned around.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah. So the other story I want to tell you is what I did to a computer or to a telescope on purpose. And somebody donated a Bird Jones telescope.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, you know about Bird Jones telescopes. It's a grand idea. I don't want to disparage the concept, because putting a corrector lens in front of a spherical mirror should work. Yeah. And I think it probably does work if everything is collimated properly and you've got the right lenses, and if it's done well, it's probably a pretty good design. But boys, manufacturers who will remain nameless have been making these little crappy Bird Jones telescopes, and somebody donated it to the Astronomy Club because they couldn't get it to work. And well, big surprise, the corrector lenses weren't the right lenses. They weren't angled correctly, and I started trying to fix this telescope, and I finally realized, other than just redesigning it from the bottom up and using the same tube, there was really no fixing that telescope. So instead, what I did was I took the mirrors out, because those could still be salvaged, and then I jumped up and down on the tube and smashed it flat. And I'll tell you what, the only reason I regret doing that is because after the fact, somebody mentioned to me, well, you could have used it for a garbage can. And it's like, okay, that would have been the most perfect way to use that Bird Jones telescope. So honestly, I regret having smashed it, but I do not regret having removed it from the pool of possible telescopes. I didn't want to give it to Goodwill and then inflict it on somebody else.
It'll just come back. Like the CONUS, right? Like then you'll have this person emailing you, say, hey, could you help me with the telescope? And then they show up with it, right?
Every year in January, our Astronomy Club has a telescope workshop where we invite the public to bring their telescopes, and we'll help collimate them and line up their finders and stuff, Well, one year somebody brought a scope that they got at Goodwill, and it was one of these little Meade go-to scopes with a computer controller and all. And the electronics, surprise, the electronics actually worked. But the scope would slew about halfway around and then just stop. And you could hear the motors moving and that. But we finally popped the case open and saw that these little plastic gears had stripped out. Yeah. And so we told them, well, unless you can replace the gears, it's a manual telescope from here. Yeah. And so they took it away. And the next year, this telescope shows up again with different people. And we asked him, it took us a while to realize it was the same telescope. And we asked him, where'd you get it? And they said, Goodwill. And it was like, okay, don't donate it to Goodwill, or we're going to see that again next year.
Let Jerry jump up and down on it for a few minutes.
Right. I do plan to write an article. My Astronomer's Workbench article is basically on retrofitting scopes and building things. And so I do plan to write an article on what to do when the electronics or the gearing dies in your go-to telescope. They still make fine manual telescopes, but you've got to be able to get in there and release the clutches and, design it as an Altaz telescope. So that's a project I've got. I'm kind of waiting for a broken Altaz telescope so that I can actually do it and take some pictures while I'm doing it. But that will ultimately become a column, I hope.
Cool. Well, that sounds good. I like that story. Let's talk about your writing for a few minutes before we get on to the telescope making. Listeners might be interested in your science fiction story or your stories, because many of our listeners are science fiction fans. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about this writing outlet for those that might be interested.
Sure. It's funny. I've wanted to be a writer pretty much all my life. And in fact, my mom used to tell a story about when I was about 5 years old. I had one of those big fat pencils the size of your thumb, and we called them Big Chief tablets, right? Notepad. And I was scribbling something, and Mom said, "Well, you're going to be a writer someday." And I said to my mother, "Well, I already am." She saved some of my early work, and it was all science fiction. I wrote about going to the moon and meeting up with moon aliens and going to war with the aliens and all that stuff. Illustrated, of course, in my 5 or 6 year old style. I've always wanted to be a science fiction writer. Always knew that's what I was going to be even when I went off to college. So I took English courses and writing courses and stuff. And then when my wife, Kathy, got a job as a medical technologist, the pay was good enough that I could actually start writing full time and take those 2 or 3 or 5 years that it takes to kind of build up a reputation and, start actually selling stories and even novels. And I was lucky in that it only took me a year to break in. And I think 3 or 4 years before I was able to sell a novel. But still, the money was not great, but it was experience, and I got my name out there. And I like to write hard science fiction, the kind that has, relies pretty heavily on science. And the idea is if you take the science away, the story falls apart. So that's the kind of story I like to write. And it was well received right from the start. I got a lot of fan mail, and editors liked my stuff, especially the editor at Analog magazine. He would buy practically anything I sent to him. So I got to where I just would send it to Analog first because I knew he was going to buy it.
Yeah.
Every now and then he would surprise me and reject something and say, "Okay, that's too far out." Or sometimes he'd say, "Well, we just published one by Charles Sheffield with the same idea." So, I felt like, well, if I'm writing Charles Sheffield's caliber of story, I guess I'm not doing too shabby.
Yeah.
Started winning some awards. Won the Nebula Award one year for a story that I was pretty proud of, and that was a story about the Apollo space program, the ghost of the Apollo space program. Ghostly Saturn V materializing at Cape Canaveral and launching, and it was weird. It was the first time I'd written something kind of woo-woo. It was not really hard science fiction at all, but it was well received.
So what's a good way for people to maybe take a look at a sampling of your work, and where can they find I guess you're writing for Analog as well.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a Amazon bookstore front.
Right.
How can people find you?
Right now, the Amazon, Amazon electronic books, I guess, are really the only way.
Okay.
I'm semi-retired at this point. I don't do much in the way of writing anymore, so I haven't had a novel out in, a decade. So there's only one book-length thing in print, and that's a collection of short stories from a company called Wheatland Press.
Okay.
So that can be found. But also, right now, I think if people were to Google for it, they could search for my latest story that was in Analog. It's called Shepherd Moons, and it was put up on their website for free because it was nominated for an award.
Nice.
And so, in order to let the people who are voting on the awards, have easy access to it, Analog put it up online, and I think it's still there. And the neat thing about that is it's an astronomy story.
Oh, cool.
It is a story of what would happen. It was alternate universe now because I wrote it before we sent the mission out to whack into an asteroid and change its orbit.
Yep.
And so I wrote that story in December of the year before we did that. I guess we hit the asteroid in September of 2022. So I wrote it in December of 21 because there's such a lead time in publishing. That you've got to be way ahead of things. So I got that turned in early January of 2022, and the editor Analog liked it well enough to kind of expedite it and got it into the September issue. And September was the month that we whacked into that asteroid with our space probe. And of course, I wrote a story about what would happen if, when we are at the last seconds before the impact, we see that there's an alien outpost, and we're just about to. Yes, we obliterate. Right. Oh, indeed, we obliterate an alien outpost, and it's like, oops. Sorry, guys, didn't mean to do that.
That's so quintessentially human, though, right?
Oh yeah. So so obviously, the rest of the story is the fallout from that. And I will just say that I like to write happy stories. I don't like stories that end poorly and have sad endings. So this actually does have a very happy ending, and it's a really fun story. And it won the Reader's Choice Award for the year's best novelette in Analog magazine, which that is a really cool thing. I was very pleased that readers cared enough to vote for it. And that was neat.
Well, congratulations on that.
Yeah.
That's super cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
When did you begin writing the Astronomer's Workbench column in Sky and Telescope? Was that about 12 years ago or something like that?
Not that long. I started in 2016, I think it was.
2016. You had articles though prior to that, because I remember some of these ones from 5 or 6 years before that even. Right.
My first one was when I came up with the concept for a trackball telescope. It's a ball scope that actually tracks.
Yeah.
And so that was back when Gary Saronic was editing the column.
Right.
And in those days, often as not, you could write your own article. Gary would just be the editor. And so I was actually allowed to write the article myself.
Right.
And it's published under my name. And we did that several times with various things that I did. And then they changed the format of the column to where Gary wrote all the columns, and so I would just provide information and Gary would write about the stuff.
Oh, okay.
But then he moved on to edit a magazine called Sky News.
That's
Canadian magazine. And so he asked me if I would just take over as the writer for the column. And I tell you what, man, that was a day of jumping up and down for joy. Because I love to build telescopes, and I'd like to think I'm a pretty good writer, and I like to write.
Yeah,
it's the perfect combination. You couldn't offer me a better job. So yeah, I thought about that for about 2 milliseconds and said, sure, I'll do that.
I have to say, and I've been a long time subscriber, sort of off and on over many years, and I have frequently, when not being a subscriber, purchased the ones with your articles, because there's always two things that catch my attention. One is the photos. I put a couple of the photos. We don't really publish much, but I stole them and put them in our notes here just for eye candy for Shane. And you see one of these photos and you're walking out of the store with that magazine. And then the other is the writing. Like, even in our communication, you always say something that really makes me want to ask like more questions or find out more. When we were writing emails back and forth in preparation for the show, you wrote something I'm curious about. You said, I'm kind of the opposite of Mel referring to Mel Bartels. When it comes to observing, I'm not much interested in faint fuzzies, but I'm more into bright eye candy. I've written an observing guide called Big, Bold, Bright, and Beautiful, which, as the name suggests, focuses on the more visible and impressive objects in the night sky. I describe each object and have illustrated many of them with sketches. The book hasn't been published yet, but is under consideration. So then I was like, well, I'm asking you about this when we talk. So you have to tell us about this book. Is it going to be published? And maybe a bit of a tantalizing taste of what might be in this text.
Okay. Well, the genesis of it, it is in fact Mel's fault. In that Mel, when he started building these really ultra fast telescopes like f2.6, I think his 10-inch f2.8 or maybe it was 2.6 was the first scope where he had such a wide field and had such a good light grasp that he was starting to find what he calls IFN,
integrated flux nebulae.
Integrated flux nebulae. That's right. Yeah. And it's this very kind of faint glow of gas and dust that's being illuminated by stars, just the general glow of the Milky Way.
Yeah.
And he was really getting deeply into this. And, every now and then we'd be observing together and he'd call me over and say, look, I found some more IFN. And I'm looking and looking and looking. And it's like, if I swing the scope back and forth, I can maybe tell that the field's getting a little brighter in one spot or the other. But I just frankly have to tell you that just didn't turn my crank, and I got to thinking about it, and it's like, well, what do I like to do? And it's like, well, every time I go out, I look at things like M13, the Great Hercules Globular Cluster, or the Andromeda Galaxy, or I love to split double stars,
Yeah.
And stuff that when you see it, you've seen it. You don't ask yourself whether or not you saw it. You know that you did, and not only did you see it, but you got a pretty good blast of photons, and so I started making a list of things that. Just to back up a little bit, my memory is a little odd in that I have a mind like a steel trap sometimes, but that's also like a steel trap that's been left in the water, kind of rusty, right? So, as the seasons roll around, I honestly forget what's coming up.
Yeah.
And there'll be something I've seen 100 times and I'll forget it's there. So I started making a list for my own use of the bright objects in the sky, the things that I enjoyed seeing. And I would actually write a little description of everything so that I would know what it was that I was looking for next time it came around. And then, let's see, I don't remember how the sequence of events works, but I eventually wound up with enough objects. I thought, well, this could be an observing article in Sky and Telescope magazine. And so I hit up Peter Tyson, the general editor, and he said, yeah, maybe not. Talk to Diana Hannakainen. She's the observing editor, and she kind of liked the idea. So she said, let's do 4 articles. Let's do spring, summer, fall, and winter. Stretch them out over the course of a couple of years because it takes some time to do the research, and we decided I would sketch everything.
Okay.
I'm not much of an artist, but I know Cindy Crouch, who is a really good sketcher, and she kind of egged me on. And I know how to use Photoshop, and so I would make these really crappy sketches with the eyepiece, and then I would use Photoshop to not just improve that sketch, but just redo it entirely. All my sketches are done entirely in Photoshop using my field notes, basically. So anyway, in order to create these articles for Sky and Telescope, I actually started developing the sketches and developing, pretty good descriptions of some of the objects. And every time I would go out, I would just add half a dozen more objects to the list. And before you know it, 2 or 3 years down the line, I've got 400 objects.
Wow.
That's a good list. That's a great list.
I didn't know there was 400 objects I would describe as bright and bold.
There are. I'd say at least 100 of them are double stars.
Yeah, well, still nice objects.
Yeah, and I didn't sketch everything. I think I've got 50 sketches, maybe 60 sketches. So I kicked around the idea of self-publishing that. I did pass it out as a PDF file to several friends, and mixed reaction. A lot of people really thought it was great as an observing guide, and a lot of people thought it was too talky, too many words. So it's like, well.
That's why you buy a book.
Right. That's kind of what I thought. You know.
There's
It's
too
like-
many words in this book, Shane.
Right.
I give
You
it a
know,
thumbs down.
I think that was a critique of one of Mozart's concertos. It's like, oh, the king said, well, too many notes. But anyway, before I publish it myself, I thought I would give Sky and Telescope a shot at it. And that was kind of at the point where Sky and Telescope magazine was bought by the American Astronomical Society.
Yeah.
So there was kind of a hiatus there. Well, anyway, they're back to maybe publishing books. They're not sure if they're going to do that or not.
I think they should.
I think they should too. And I think they should start with my book.
I think I think they should. I think this is because I think this is something that has appeal to everybody, whether you're somebody who is relatively new to astronomy, and even people who are not as new to astronomy, maybe not Mel Bartels, but a lot of us just who like to go out. One of the books that I recently bought has like 100 objects that are kind of in a similar vein, and they've been selling a lot of that text, and certainly I've bought it. I'm a bit of a bibliophile myself, and lots of our listeners are as well. If that does come out, I will buy a copy and give my unbiased review, regardless of how many words are in the text.
Oh, very good. Glad to hear that. Yeah. Well, the thing is, I actually use it myself when I go out. That was its original purpose, and that's what I actually use it for. Is on any random night, I'll go out, and it's keyed to the Pocket Sky Atlas.
Yeah.
So
Nice.
I look and see what's going to be high in the sky that night, and I turn to that page in my big, bold, bright, and beautiful. And then I just kind of run through the list and look for whatever objects I think are going to be cool that night.
That's really neat, because that's sort of a similar vein of what Robert Burnham Jr. did with Burnham's Celestial Handbook, where he was compiling stuff in many ways for his own observing. But when you do that, it sort of becomes ultimately useful to any observer.
Right. Yeah. And that's the thing. I felt like if I made it useful for myself, then it would be useful, hopefully, for newcomers who'd never seen these objects before, but also for people who had been around for a while, because I've been doing this for 20 years now. Yeah. And yet I still go for these objects more than the really faint stuff. And it's just a really good list, I think, in my humble opinion. It's a good list of the more or less eye candy. And I'm sure I've missed a lot of stuff. I could probably do 700 or 800 objects if I did them all. Yeah. But and I haven't got the Southern Sky. That will be volume 2 if I can actually spend a year or two in Australia. Yeah.
Go ahead, Shane.
I was just going to say the other side of this is I remember, I think I was at the Saskatchewan Summer Star Party, and one of my observing friends was observing objects in the Herschel 400.
Okay.
And I said, how is it? I'm into galaxies. And he said, well, I got one here. Have a look. And I took a look. I'm like, oh, that's pretty faint. He's like, yeah, they all are. They all look like that.
They do. One of my observing companions is very, very much into deep sky objects, and he's looking for these IC galaxies and PGC galaxies, and I like the Yankees chain by whenever I go out in the spring or early summer, I'll look for Hoag's object. It's that that circular galaxy. That
circle with the thing in the middle. Yeah.
It's 14th magnitude, maybe, but the surface brightness is like 19th or 20th. I mean, it's all I can do to even detect a photon or two from it in my 20-inch telescope.
In the 20-inch, yeah.
So, Andy's looking for Hickson galaxies, and I'm looking for Hoag's object. It's like, I've got a fainter object than you do. So there. But generally, he's finding galaxies, and I'm finding M5 for the 2000th time, and actually looking for variable stars in M5. That's something
neat.
That's something that geeks can do on bright objects.
Yeah.
And all together, it just kind of came together a piece at a time until one day I set it up in the driveway, and started tweaking the mirrors so that the two images would merge. And man, M13 came over in stereo. And yeah, suddenly it was worth every minute that I put into it.
Yeah, I can only imagine. Is it different, Jerry? Like, because how you, I guess, put your eye to the telescope is different, right? You're sort of at the front of the telescope where the light's entering. So when you're trying to find an object, is it different to move this telescope, or does it just kind of seem normal to you and almost like any other scope?
Well, the cool thing about this is that the binoscope inverts everything up. It makes everything upside down, but it's okay left, right. Mm-hmm. But because you're looking down into it and the telescope is looking over your shoulders at what's behind you, it feels exactly the same as moving a Dobsonian telescope around. The image goes in exactly the same way. It's just that it's looking over your shoulder instead of out in front of you. And so it's totally intuitive. When you're star hopping, though, you have to invert your map upside down, but you can't invert it. You can't just like turn it 180 degrees the way you do with the Dob. So I've learned when I'm using that scope, I actually use Sky Safari, and I flip the screen upside down. There's a control that does that, and so that way I can use the planetarium program. It will match what I see in the eyepieces, and I can still star hop my way to an object.
No, right on.
But it's really intuitive, actually, to move one of these reverse. That's kind of, we call them a reverse binocular because it's looking over your shoulders.
I've always been intrigued by these Dobsonian telescopes just because of the aperture and then using two eyes. Wow. Very, very awesome design. I love this.
Well, there's a thing that we call the binocular summing factor. And, you can argue all day long about what the actual number is, but it seems like the binocular scope, like a 12-inch binocular scope, is about the equivalent of maybe an 18-inch single scope in terms of what you can see, because you're using both eyes and your brain is doing a lot of image processing that doesn't happen when you just use one eye. I can still see a little bit deeper with my 20-inch scope than I can with the 12-inch bino. But, I think the 12-inch bino sees deeper than like a 16-inch scope. And then there's that whole stereo thing. You look at the moon, and it looks like it's about 5 feet out in front of you, and it looks like you could reach out and touch it, and it would be round. It doesn't look like a flat thing. It's a round rock with things on it.
And nobody had to sand that.
No sanding whatsoever.
Yeah. Well, and there's the comfort factor too of using two eyes, which is why I've become a big fan of bino viewing. I find I can just look at an object for hours if I want. Whereas when I'm using one eye, I need to take breaks, and I just find it fatiguing sometimes using one eye. So I love this.
Me too. And the weird thing with me, when I'm pretty much right eye dominant. So when I observe with a monoscope, I'm using my right eye. My left eye begins to itch, and it starts to itch just uncontrollably. And it's one of those weird physiological things. Like, I have no idea why it does that, but it drives me nuts. And so there are some nights I take the binoscope out just because I don't want my eye itching. Yeah. And it takes longer to set up and tear down, I have to say. It's a 20-minute job on each end of the evening. But, it is so worth it. I mean, that first look at any object through the binoscope, it's like, oh, yeah, that's why I did this.
Yeah, that's great.
Please be sure to write us with your show ideas, questions, and comments to actualastronomy@gmail.com.
Thank you, everyone, for listening, and we hope you enjoyed the show. If you are interested in more information, would like to contact us, or if you would like to support the podcast, check out our website, actualastronomy.com.